A lot of people say that you can't improve at LSAT reading comprehension. The good news is that they are wrong. LSAT reading comprehension just feels impossible because everyone is using the wrong mental approach. You were probably taught in college, in high school, or even in your LSAT prep course that reading comp is about reading carefully, understanding everything, and memorizing the details. So you try to be thorough. You slow down and you try to absorb every single sentence. And ironically, that is exactly what makes reading comprehension fall apart because the LSAT is not testing whether you understand everything, it's testing whether you understand what matters. And so, what I want to share with you today is what you should be paying attention to, what you can safely ignore, and why the questions feel so confusing right now. And once that clicks, reading comp becomes calmer, more predictable, and boring in the best way possible. So if reading comp has always felt like the section where you just hope for the best, I want you to be willing to change your approach. Because the problem isn't that you can't do reading comp, it's that no one ever showed you how the LSAT actually wants you to think while you read. The single most important thing you've got to understand about LSAT reading comp is that this is not a reading test. The LSAT is not testing whether you read fast. And it's not testing whether you enjoy reading. And it's definitely not testing whether you remember every single detail. It's testing how you think while you read. And most students approach reading comp the way they'd approach a textbook or a class assignment. They think to themselves, I've got to understand everything. I've got to remember this. I'll figure out what matters later. And that instinct makes total sense because that's how reading works everywhere else in life. But on the LSAT, that approach backfires because you are not reading to learn, you are reading to orient yourself. You're trying to answer a much smaller set of questions like, why does this passage exist? Or what is the author doing here? Or how do the parts fit together? Think of it like this. If I were to ask you to, say, summarize a movie, you wouldn't list every single scene in order. You'd say something like, it's about this person trying to do this thing, and here is the main conflict. That is the orientation, and that is exactly what the LSAT rewards. They want you to build a map of the passage, not a transcript or a summary. So you want to know, where does the author introduce the topic? Where do the viewpoints change? And where does the author take a position if they take one at all? And once you see reading comp that way, a lot of the pressure that you're feeling will automatically disappear because you'll stop feeling like you need to get everything, you'll stop rereading out of panic, and you'll stop blaming yourself when a sentence feels dense or technical. Difficulty doesn't mean that you're failing, it just means that this part probably is not the main point. And that is the foundation for everything else we're going to talk about today. And if you get this part right, the rest of reading comprehension becomes learnable and even easy. If you don't, though, it's going to feel slippery no matter how many passages you do. And so I want you to remember that reading comp is not about reading better. It's about thinking more strategically as you read. And once you internalize that, reading comp stops being mysterious. Now, the people who write the LSAT reading comp passages are not just throwing information at you. Every single passage exists for a reason. Someone is doing something in that passage. They're making a claim, they're explaining an idea, they're comparing two viewpoints, or they are criticizing an existing position. That is it. No matter how weird the topic sounds in reading comp, whether it's 19th century art or legal history, biology, economics, the passage always fits into one of those buckets. And here is why that matters. It's because the LSAT's not testing whether you understand the topic. It's testing whether you can follow what the author is doing with the topic. So instead of asking yourself, do I understand this sentence? I want you to start asking a better question, which is, why did the author include this? That question changes everything. That way, when a new theory appears, you can ask yourself, is this the author's view or is it someone else's? And when a study or example shows up, you can ask, what is this example supporting or illustrating? And when the passage shifts in tone, you ask, did the author just take a side? And once you read this way, reading comp stops feeling like a memory test because now you're not trying to hold on to information, you are tracking the roles. This paragraph sets up the problem. This one introduces a competing view. This one explains why that view is flawed, and this one moves us toward a conclusion. And here's the key insight most people miss. The questions are not testing random facts. They're testing whether you understand those roles. And that's why wrong answers so often feel tempting. It's because they mention something that was in the passage, but they assign it the wrong job. They treat the background as a conclusion. They treat a critic's view as the author's, and they treat an example as the main point. And if you weren't tracking what each part was doing, those traps are incredibly hard to see. And so from now on, I want you to read with a simpler mindset. Every paragraph has a purpose, every idea has a job, and every question is asking whether you followed that logic. Once you start reading with that lens, the test writers stop feeling sneaky and they start feeling predictable. Now let's talk about the mistakes that keep really smart students stuck in reading comp. Because if reading comp has been your weakest section, it's probably not because you are lazy or unfocused. It's because you're doing things that feel responsible, but actually work against you on the test. The first big mistake is trying to understand every single sentence. You read a line that feels dense and you think to yourself, I can't move on until this makes sense. So you reread it, then you reread it again, and before you know it, you've spent 30 seconds wrestling with one sentence, and you've lost the thread of the entire passage. The sad truth is that the LSAT does not reward sentence-by-sentence mastery. It rewards your directional understanding. So if a sentence feels confusing, but you know roughly what role it plays, that is enough. It is okay to move on. The second big mistake is highlighting too much. Some students highlight every single line, others underline whole paragraphs, and what that really means is that nothing stood out. Highlighting is only useful if it marks structure, like a shift in viewpoint, the author's opinion, or a conclusion. But if you highlight everything, you are prioritizing nothing. The third big mistake is panicking when the topic feels boring or technical. Could be a science passage, a legal theory passage, or say something about art history from the 1800s. And your brain immediately goes, this is not my thing, I'm in trouble. And that reaction makes reading comp harder because now you are reading emotionally instead of strategically. And so here is what I want you to internalize. Boring does not mean important. And technical does not mean they're going to test it. In fact, the denser the language is, the more likely it is just background or setup, not the main point. And the last big mistake is treating confusion as failure. If you hit a tough paragraph and you think to yourself, I should understand this by now, that thought is creating panic. But confusion is not necessarily a problem. Confusion that you are not tracking is a problem though. As long as you know where the passage got fuzzy, you can still answer most questions correctly. Reading comp falls apart when you expect to feel total clarity on a passage. So if you're struggling, don't beat yourself up. These mistakes are common because they're logical, they're just not aligned with how the LSAT actually works. And once you stop making them, reading comp starts to feel a lot more manageable. The top scorers are not super readers, they're not skimming faster, and they're not understanding more details than you are. What they do have is a different mental posture when they read. They are reading with intention. From the very first paragraph, top scorers ask themselves a simple question. They ask, why is the author telling me this? Not, do I understand every word? Not, will this be tested in the questions? They're just asking, why is this here? What is the role of this statement? And so when a passage introduces a theory, they don't immediately accept it as truth. They ask, is this the author's view or is it someone else's? When a competing position shows up, they notice the contrast. When the tone shifts, even slightly, they pause and they think, okay, something just changed. And that awareness is everything. High scorers are constantly tracking who believes what. What does the author believe? What do the critics believe, the researchers, the historical view? And they're not memorizing details about those views, they just know where each one appears in the passage. And here's a key difference that most students miss. Top scorers are comfortable not fully understanding something. If a paragraph gets technical, they don't slow down. They just think to themselves, all right, this is probably background or support, and they keep moving forward because they trust that if a detail matters, the question will bring them back to it. And that changes how the entire section feels because instead of reading defensively, they read strategically. They are just trying to stay oriented. And that's why reading comp feels easier for them. Not because it's actually easier, but because they are controlling their read. And once you adopt that same mindset, your reading comp score increases pretty quickly. Now, I want to walk you through what should actually be going on in your head while you read an LSAT passage in real time. When you start the first paragraph, you are not trying to master it. You are asking one question. What is this about, and why does it exist? That is it. You want the topic, and you want the purpose. If the passage opens with background or history, that's totally fine. You just note this is the setup. Then, as you move into the next paragraph, you stay alert for shifts. If there's a new theory, a competing view, a problem with the existing explanation, anytime something changes, you give it more attention. When the passage introduces a viewpoint, you quietly label it in your head. This is the traditional view, or this is what some critics argue, or this seems to be where the author is learning. You don't need fancy language, you just need clarity. When examples or studies appear, you resist the urge to slow down. You ask, what is this example doing? Is it supporting a claim? Is it illustrating a problem? Is it showing a limitation? Once you know the role, you move on. And if something feels confusing, and it will, you do not stop. You think to yourself, okay, that paragraph was dense. I know roughly where it sits. And then you keep going. Because the last thing you want is to get disoriented. As long as you know the layout of the passage, you are in control. And by the time you finish the passage, you should be able to say in simple terms, this passage is about X, or the author's goal is Y, or these viewpoints show up here, and that is enough. Now let's talk about the questions in reading comp because that's where most students are feeling the most anxiety. A lot of folks feel the hard part is the reading, but the hard part is trusting that you read well enough because once you're oriented, the questions themselves are actually very predictable. The LSAT test writers are not creative. They are actually pretty lazy. They keep reusing the same kinds of questions over and over, like what's the main point? Why did the author write this? And how do the paragraphs relate? If you tracked the structure of the passage and the purpose, these questions should feel familiar. Other questions might send you back to the passage for a detail or an example or a claim that somebody made. And the key thing to remember is that you do not need to know where everything is. You just got to know roughly where to look. And then, of course, you have the inference questions that require a bit more reading between the lines. But there is still always support in the text to answer any particular question. You've also got patterns in the wrong answers because they are extremely consistent. Most of them fall into one of three buckets. You've got answers that are too extreme, answers that mix up viewpoints, or they answer a different question than the one that was asked. And you just got to check whether the answer is supported by the passage. And you're not guessing here, you are verifying, you're fact-finding, you're hunting for support in the passage for any particular answer choice. Now let's talk about timing, because this is where reading comp really messes with people. Most students think their timing problem comes from reading too slowly, but that is almost never the real issue. The real problem is hesitation when you second guess yourself, you reread out of fear, and you argue with the choices longer than you need to. And that can eat up all your time because stronger timing in reading comp doesn't come from moving faster, it comes from moving cleaner, from staying oriented. If you can resist panicking, you're not going to have the urge to reread everything. And when you know the structure of the passage, you know where to go for the details. Now, here's something I want you to hear clearly. You do not get extra points for fighting with a question. You don't need to earn every single answer through pain and suffering. Sometimes the smartest move is to just choose something, flag it, and move on. And if a question's taking you too long, that means you're getting stuck between two answers that are both feeling kind of imperfect, and you just got to pick one that fits the passage better and keep going, because the LSAT is strictly timed. But you also don't want to rush, because if you rush too early, if you don't understand the main point of the passage and just speed through the questions, that will create bigger problems later, because you will misread the structure and you'll lose time fixing mistakes on the back end. So you want to read calmly up front to save yourself time later and keep a steady pace. Now, there's also the review process. Most students review reading comp by checking what they got wrong, maybe reading an explanation, then moving on. And that might feel productive, but it doesn't fix the underlying problem, because mistakes in reading comp are not about missing facts, they're about misreading the structure. And so when you review a reading comp question, I don't want you asking, why is this answer wrong? The better question is, why is the right answer better based on the text of the passage? In other words, what did the right answer do that the others did not? Did it respect the author's attitude? Did it stay in the scope of the passage? Did it correctly identify the main viewpoint? And then you want to trace your mistake backward. You want to ask yourself, did I misread the author's main point? Did I confuse who believed what? Did I treat an example like it was the main point? And those patterns repeat. And once you see your personal reading comp patterns, you will improve. You also don't want to use explanations as a crutch. They can be useful, of course, but only after you've tried to justify the correct answer from the passage itself. You want to look at how you read and retrain your process. Most mistakes are those of process, and that's why doing fewer passages with deeper review is better than burning through a ton of passages mindlessly.